Before we solve these genetics problems, let's look at some of the important terminology. If you do not have a good understanding of this terminology, it's almost going to be impossible for you to solve any of the genetics problems because you won't know how to set up these problems. So let's first talk about what controls the traits that we have. So it's important to remember that every single physical trait that you have, every single physical characteristic that you can see in yourself or in another individual is caused by their genes. And genes are simply just sections of the DNA that act as instructions to make a protein. So these sections of DNA contain a specific DNA sequence, and that specific DNA sequence tells your body what protein to make. And if your body makes that protein, then that protein will cause you to have a specific physical characteristic, a physical trait. Okay? This protein could cause a disease, or maybe there's a gene that has a mutation that you can't make a protein, and this may also lead to a disease. Okay? So it's these genes that are controlling for these proteins that are controlling for a trait that you have, a physical characteristic. Now, it's important to remember that every single trait that you have, every single physical characteristic that you have, has two copies of a gene controlling it. All right, so you have two copies of every gene in your body. And the reason that is because you are diploid. Okay, your cells are all diploid, which means they have two sets of chromosomes. And you got one of those sets from one of your parents, and you got the other set from another parent. And this is why you have two copies of every gene in your body. So if we look at one of these pairs of chromosomes, what we can see here is that at every location along the chromosome, there are pairs of genes. So here we can see two copies of a gene at this one location. One copy is on each chromosome. And as you can see here by this capital and lowercase letter, these genes are not identical here. Okay? There can be slight variations in the copies of the genes that we have. And these slight variations in the copies of the genes that we have are called alleles. What causes us to have different alleles? Why are these two copies of a gene not alike? Well, it's because of gene mutations. If you change the DNA sequence at all, it's going to change what protein is made. And this creates variation in our genes. This is why not every single individual looks alike. Because if every single individual had the exact same genes, and their genes were exactly the same DNA sequence, well, we would all look exactly alike. We need these variations in these genes to create all the diversity that you see. Now, when we're talking about very simple genetics, there's only two variations of a gene that are typically present. One variation of this gene is called a dominant allele. Okay? The dominant allele or dominant variation is called dominant because if an individual has that variation of the gene, they will always express that variation. Okay, so they will always express that dominant allele or that dominant variation of the gene. And we usually indicate that an allele is dominant by using a capital letter. Okay, so a dominant allele or a dominant variation of a gene is represented by this capital letter. And if an individual has a capital letter, then it doesn't matter what the other copy of their gene is. They will always express that dominant letter. They will always express whatever characteristic is controlled by that dominant letter, that dominant allele. Okay? And this is why it's called dominant. It will always overpower the other copy of the gene, no matter what it is. Okay? So, one variation of the allele, it can be dominant or always expressed if present, and that means that the other variation of the allele that typically could be present is called a recessive allele. A recessive allele is not expressed when paired with a dominant allele. So that means that if you look like this individual here with a big G and a little g, they will not show this characteristic that's controlled by the little g, okay, by the recessive allele, because it's hidden in them. This big letter is overpowering the other letter, okay? It's masking the recessive allele. The only way that the recessive allele is expressed is when it's paired with another recessive allele. So what that means is that if an individual, so this individual over here, we can see that they have a big G, little g, okay? So what are they going to express? Well, they're going to only show the characteristic of this big G. This little g is going to be hidden in that individual. However, what if their chromosomes look like this? So what if it was, I'm going to draw this here. And let's say the other one, I wonder if I can change the color here. Pen color, let's make it blue. So the other allele, so these are my two chromosomes. All right, so another possibility could be that here they have a little letter and a little letter. Well, if the individual looked like this, would they be able to express that dominant allele? Well, no, the only possibility is that they express the recessive allele, because that's the only thing present in them. So only in this situation here, if both copies of their gene are recessive, will they be able to express that variation of the gene. Okay, so as you can see here, the presence of these dominant alleles and recessive alleles determines how an individual will look. So let's look at some more terminology here. So one thing that's really important to be able to know about an individual is their genetic makeup. In other words, this means what type of alleles make up that individual. So the term we use to describe someone's genetic makeup or the type of alleles or letters that they have is called the genotype. Each individual has two alleles that control a trait. We just talked about that. They have two copies of a gene, right, that can control a trait. And as we just also mentioned, the alleles can be the same or they can be different. All right, so there's three different words that we use to describe these possible combination of alleles an individual could have. So both of these copies could be the same, and they both could be the dominant allele, so we would call that individual homozygous dominant. This word homozygous, that just means same. So what it means is that both copies of the gene are the same and both of them are dominant, so they would have two big A's, okay? If an individual has a big A and a little a, or a big letter and a little letter, a dominant allele and a recessive allele, then we would call that heterozygous. Hetero means different. If an individual has two of the tiny little letters, the lowercase letters, or two recessive alleles, well, then we call them homozygous recessive. This here is the only three possible combinations of genes that an individual can have, right? Because every individual has two copies of a gene, and the possible variations of that gene are a dominant allele or a recessive allele. These are all the different possible combinations you could have of those dominant and recessive alleles. So some other terms that you might see is this term true breeding. We say an individual is true breeding if they have two of the same alleles? Well, there's two different ways you could have two of the same alleles, right? You could have two big A's, or you could have two little a's. The reason that an individual is called true breeding if they have two of the same alleles is we know that this individual can only give to their offspring the genes that they have, right? So if an individual is big A, well, what can they give their offspring? Well, they can only give their offspring a dominant allele. So they're true breeding for the dominant allele or the dominant trait. Whereas an individual that's little a, well, what could they give their offspring? Well, they could only give their offspring a little a. So they're true breeding for that recessive allele. Okay. Another important term that you might see is carrier. A carrier is simply a heterozygous individual. And it's another word used for a heterozygous individual because a lot of disorders are caused by a recessive allele. So we usually call an individual that's carrying that disorder, but not. So if an individual is heterozygous for a disease caused by a recessive allele, that means that they will carry the recessive allele, but they're not going to express it. Okay, if you're heterozygous, as here, you're not going to express that little letter, but you could carry it, and therefore you could still pass that on to your offspring. This is why some people, we say you are a carrier of a disease. You don't show the disease, but your child could could potentially inherit the allele to cause that disease. And the last term that you should know is this term phenotype. That is a physical appearance of the individual, okay? And what controls their physical appearance? Well, the combination of genes that they have. So let's do a little bit of practice with this. Let's say we're looking at moth color, as you can see here. And let's say we know that this trait is controlled by two copies of a gene in an individual, right? Because we've already talked about that each individual has two copies of a gene that controls a trait. They can have two variations of this gene. They can have one that's dominant, represented by this big D, and one that's recessive, represented by this little d. In the case of moth color, the dominant allele causes the individual to be dark, whereas a recessive allele causes the individual to be of light color. Knowing the laws or the rules of genetics, if an individual has a big D and a big D on their homologous chromosomes, then we would call that homozygous dominant because they have the same alleles and both of them are dominant. Homozygous dominant. If an individual has two different variations of the gene, so a big D and a little d, then they are called heterozygous, a big D and a little d. If an individual has the same variation of a gene, so the exact same alleles, little d, and both of them are recessive, lowercase letter, then we call that homozygous recessive. Once again, that's the only three possible gene combinations that you can have. It makes solving these genetics problems actually a lot more simple than they could be because there's only three possibilities here. So let's talk about how these individuals will look. In other words, what is their phenotype? Well, we know that if they have the big D, they will always look like that. Okay, they'll always show the characteristic controlled by that. So let's look and see what we have here. Does this individual that's homozygous dominant have a big D? They do. So that means that they have to be dark color. Does the individual that's heterozygous have a big D? Well, yes, they do. Well, what do they look like then? Well, they have to be dark color because they have the dominant allele. It doesn't matter what this second letter is. This letter here, it does not matter what this is here. No matter what, if they have a big letter, they will show that big letter. That's why it is called the dominant allele. All right, so this individual's dark. If an individual looks like what we see down here, they don't have a dominant letter. So they can't express, they could never be dark color, right? This individual has two little d's. Their physical characteristic in this case would have to be whatever the little allele causes or the lowercase letter causes, so they would be light colored. Okay, so this is how we can predict how an individual will look by knowing what their genotype is or what combination of alleles they have. One other thing I want to point out is that notice that there's two different types of genotypes that can cause an individual to be dark or to have the dominant or to express the dominant allele, all right? So the dominant trait, which doesn't mean the one that's most common in the population, it just means the one that's controlled by the dominant allele, right? So the dominant physical characteristic can be caused by two different genotypes. What that means is if I was holding a dark colored moth in front of you, you don't know what its genetic makeup is because it could either be homozygous dominant or heterozygous, okay? You don't know that just by looking at it. However, there's only one possibility, one possible genotype that can create the recessive characteristic or the recessive physical characteristic. So if I'm holding a light colored moth in front of you, if you knew that light color was caused by a lowercase letter or recessive allele, then you would know this individual has to be homozygous recessive. It's the only way that they could be light colored. Right? There's no other possible allele combination that would create that.